The evening began like many others in the quiet Oregon town where Margaret Lewis had lived for most of her adult life, calm on the surface, steady in rhythm, and wrapped in the soft colors of early fall, but beneath that calm something unseen was already moving. Something that would soon change the shape of her world. Margaret was 51, a widow of 6 years, and a woman who carried her life with quiet strength, waking early, working at the local library, cooking simple dinners, and finding comfort in routines that had helped her survive loss. And on this particular evening she stood near the living room window watching leaves slide across the sidewalk while the sky dimmed into a pale gray, thinking of nothing important, only enjoying the stillness. Until she heard the sound of the front door open later than usual and sensed, without any clear reason, that the stillness was about to end. Her son Ethan stepped inside, tall, thoughtful, his jacket half-zipped, his movements quick as if he wanted the moment to pass, and he smiled at her, but the smile felt practiced, thin, not the easy one she knew, and Margaret noticed it instantly because mothers always do, especially mothers who have raised a child alone through grief and growth, teaching him values not with lectures but with presence, patience, and example. Ethan had returned home after college only 3 months earlier, saying he needed time to figure out his next step, and Margaret had welcomed him without question. Proud of the man he had become, polite, gentle, careful with words, and confident that the respect she had taught him was rooted deeply enough to guide him even in confusion, yet that night something in his eyes looked unsettled, as if he were carrying a thought too heavy to speak, and when Margaret asked how his day had been, he answered quickly, "Fine," then moved toward the stairs before she could ask more, leaving behind a silence that felt sharper than his words. Margaret told herself not to overthink it, reminding herself that young adults change, that distance is natural. But as she turned back to the window, a memory surfaced uninvited, one of her late husband reminding her years ago that intuition is often truth knocking softly, and she felt a small ache in her chest, not fear, not anger, but a quiet awareness that something important was beginning. Over the next few days, that feeling grew stronger as small details refused to fit together. Ethan spending more time on his phone, stepping outside to take calls, laughing softly and then going quiet when she entered the room, and Margaret, who respected privacy, tried to ignore it, yet she could not ignore the way her own life seemed to tilt slightly, as if she were standing on ground that had started to shift. On Wednesday afternoon, while organizing returns at the library, Margaret received a call from Claire Bennett, her closest friend for over a decade, and the sound of Claire's voice alone made Margaret pause because it carried a strain she had never heard before, tight and careful, like someone choosing each word as if it might break something fragile. And when Claire asked if they could meet later, just to talk, Margaret agreed without hesitation, unaware that this conversation would pull the thread that unraveled everything. They met at a small cafe near the river, a familiar place filled with soft music and quiet conversations, and Claire arrived early, her coffee untouched, her hands folded together as if holding herself still, and as Margaret sat down, she noticed how Claire avoided eye contact, how her shoulders were tense, and before Margaret could ask what was wrong, Claire took a slow breath and said she needed to be honest, not because she wanted to be, but because not being honest was hurting everyone. The words came carefully but clearly as Claire explained that Ethan had grown close to her over the past few weeks, that it had started with long talks about life, grief, and feeling lost, conversations that felt harmless at first, even supportive, but had slowly crossed into something heavier, something emotional, something that made Claire deeply uncomfortable and deeply sad, and Margaret listened without interrupting, her face calm while her mind raced, trying to understand how two people she trusted completely could have stepped into such a fragile space. Claire insisted that nothing improper had happened, that she had stopped the conversations once she realized the direction they were taking. But Ethan had confessed feelings, emotions he did not fully understand, and that confession alone had shattered something sacred, not because of romance, but because of the meaning behind it, the line it crossed, the trust it bent. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle over her slowly, not like a storm, but like a heavy fog, dulling sound, dulling thought, and she realized that the pain she felt was not jealousy or betrayal in the usual sense, but grief for a boundary that had been touched without care, a boundary she believed protected both love and respect. When she returned home that evening, the house felt different, quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. and Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting, his hands folded, his face pale. And Margaret understood then that this was not a misunderstanding or rumor but a truth already acknowledged, already real. She did not speak right away, choosing instead to sit across from him, feeling the years between them stretch and fold at the same time, remembering him as a child who once asked her why some rules mattered even when no one was watching, and how she had answered that rules exist to protect what we love, not to control it. As Ethan looked up, guilt written clearly in his eyes, Margaret felt the first quiet break inside her. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep, and in that moment she knew that the peace she had felt only days earlier had been real, but fragile, and that its ending marked the beginning of a truth she could not turn away from, no matter how painful it would be to face. The days after that evening moved quickly, not in events but in emotion, as if time itself had decided to rush forward while Margaret struggled to keep her balance, and the house that once felt safe now felt careful, filled with pauses and half-spoken words, because although Ethan remained polite and present, there was a distance in him that felt heavier than silence, and Margaret sensed he was waiting for her to speak first, to name what both of them already knew, yet she needed clarity before confronting him, so she reached out to Claire again, asking for honesty without protection or softness, and when they met the second time, Claire spoke openly, explaining how the bond with Ethan had formed slowly, how shared loneliness had turned into long conversations, and how admiration had quietly slipped into attachment before either of them fully noticed. And Margaret listened with a steady face while inside her heart struggled to understand how affection, when left without limits, can grow into confusion even without intention. Claire admitted she felt seen and valued during a time when she herself was rebuilding after divorce, and Ethan, searching for direction and identity, found comfort in someone who listened without judgment, but comfort had shifted into emotional dependence, and that shift was where the line broke, because Margaret realized that while no rules had been spoken, the meaning of those relationships was clear, and once crossed, even gently, they leave marks. When Margaret returned home, she chose not to delay the conversation any longer, because silence had begun to feel like permission, and she found Ethan in the backyard, staring at the sky as if answers might fall from it, and when she called his name, he turned slowly, already bracing himself, and she told him she knew everything, not in anger, not with accusation, but with calm honesty that left no room for denial. Ethan spoke quickly then, words spilling out in confusion, explaining that he never planned for feelings to grow, that he felt lost after college, unsure of who he was or where he belonged, and that talking to Claire had made him feel understood in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. And Margaret listened without interrupting, even as each sentence landed like a small wound, because what hurt most was not his feelings but his lack of awareness about what those feelings meant. She told him that emotions are not wrong, but following them without wisdom can cause harm, especially when they reach into spaces meant to be protected by respect and restraint. And Ethan lowered his head, finally seeing that this was not about romance or age, but about trust, roles, and responsibility, things he had been taught but had failed to recognize in the moment. As they talked, the conversation moved fast and deep, cutting through excuses and landing on truth, and Margaret explained that sacred lines are often invisible, yet they exist to preserve dignity for everyone involved, and crossing them, even without physical action, can break bonds that take years to rebuild. And Ethan admitted he felt ashamed, not because he had been rejected, but because he realized how his actions placed emotional weight on others without considering the cost. Later that night, alone in her room, Margaret reflected on how easily loneliness can disguise itself as connection, and how even good people can make painful mistakes when searching for meaning. And she felt a deep sadness, not just for herself, but for Ethan, who was learning a hard lesson far earlier than he expected. The following days were marked by quiet understanding rather than tension, as Ethan took responsibility by creating distance, stepping back from all contact with Claire, and focusing instead on rebuilding trust at home. And although Margaret appreciated the effort, she knew that understanding did not erase impact, because once a line is crossed, the relationship on the other side is never quite the same. Still, she chose patience over punishment, believing that growth comes not from shame but from reflection. And as mother and son moved through those days, they both understood that something essential had been damaged, but also that acknowledging the truth was the first step toward healing. Even if the path forward remained uncertain and fragile, the conversation that came next was inevitable, and it arrived on a quiet evening when the sky was painted in soft shades of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that usually brought peace but that day carried tension instead, as Margaret asked Ethan to sit with her at the kitchen table, the same table where years ago she had helped him with homework and celebrated small victories, and as they faced each other, the weight of unspoken words hung heavily in the air, thick and palpable, while Ethan shifted in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of the table nervously, and finally he spoke, his voice low and uneven, explaining that he never meant to hurt anyone, that he had been searching for connection, understanding, and support after the uncertainty of college and early adulthood, that Claire had been someone who listened without judgment, and that over time, feelings had grown in ways he hadn't planned, emotions he didn't fully understand, and guilt that now felt overwhelming. Margaret listened carefully, her expression calm yet full of the quiet gravity that only a parent with years of experience could carry, and she chose her words deliberately, saying that feelings themselves are natural, but acting on them without awareness or consideration of boundaries can cause real pain, especially when those feelings involve people and roles meant to be protected, roles defined not by laws but by love, trust, and respect. And Ethan nodded, tears forming in his eyes as he realized the depth of what he had done, the unintentional but very real emotional consequences of crossing a line that should have remained sacred. She explained that growth comes not only from freedom to feel, but from understanding the responsibility that comes with those feelings, that relationships carry weight, and that sometimes restraint is the truest form of love, because it protects others and preserves trust. And Ethan, hearing her words, began to see clearly how carelessness in emotion could fracture relationships even without any physical act, and he admitted aloud that he felt ashamed, not for his feelings themselves, but for the confusion, pressure, and pain those feelings had caused, and for the way he had stepped into spaces he hadn't yet earned, spaces that required maturity he was still learning to develop. As they talked, Margaret encouraged Ethan to reflect on his actions, to understand that recognition and accountability are necessary steps in healing, that admitting a mistake is not weakness but the first part of building integrity, and that sometimes the hardest lessons arrive quietly but leave marks that shape character permanently. And Ethan listened, slowly absorbing each thought, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders in a way that was both humbling and clarifying, while Margaret felt the mixture of sadness and hope that comes when a parent witnesses a child confronting the consequences of emotional missteps, realizing that guidance is now more important than correction, and empathy more than discipline. The conversation flowed naturally, though fast, moving from regret to understanding, from shame to clarity, with Margaret offering wisdom without accusation, explaining that emotional boundaries exist to protect both hearts and trust, that love without insight can unintentionally harm, and that sometimes saying no, stepping back, and allowing distance are the bravest acts of love a person can take. And Ethan nodded, tears rolling down silently, finally seeing that the moment he had crossed the line was not the end but a turning point, an opportunity to learn how to respect others while understanding himself, and he promised quietly, with sincerity, to carry this lesson into the future, to rebuild trust carefully, and to honor the relationships around him with thoughtfulness. That night, the house was quiet, but it was no longer tense, filled instead with the weight of hard-earned understanding, and as Margaret prepared for bed, she reflected on the complexity of love and human emotion, on the subtle ways mistakes can happen when hearts are vulnerable, and on the quiet strength it takes to forgive without forgetting, while Ethan stayed in his room, thinking deeply, feeling both the sting of regret and the first glimmer of personal growth. And in that shared silence, mother and son understood that their bond, though shaken, had not been broken, and that the road to healing required honesty, patience, and the courage to face feelings with clarity, responsibility, and love. Time moved forward slowly yet insistently, as if the house itself was adjusting to the new reality that had settled over Margaret and Ethan, and in those weeks that followed, the tension that once hung thick in the air gradually transformed into quiet reflection, not through grand gestures but through small, deliberate choices that spoke louder than words. Claire had moved to another city, creating necessary distance to heal her own heart and avoid further confusion, and Ethan, now acutely aware of the boundaries he had crossed, took steps to rebuild both trust and his own sense of self, finding work at a local bookstore, focusing on routines, and spending time outdoors to clear his mind, while Margaret observed him with a mix of concern, relief, and cautious hope, understanding that growth is often invisible in its early stages, seen only in consistency, effort, and the subtle ways a person learns to carry responsibility without complaint. Their conversations became different, no longer about small daily matters or casual news, but about emotions, choices, and life, about what it means to care for someone while respecting limits, and Margaret gently guided him, offering advice without judgment, reminders about empathy, patience, and the importance of thinking before acting, knowing that the lessons he learned now would shape the man he was becoming, and that trust, once bent, could only be restored through honesty, humility, and time. Ethan, in turn, reflected constantly on the past, acknowledging the mistake not with bitterness or self-pity, but with clarity, accepting that the feelings he had harbored were natural yet misplaced, and that understanding their consequences was essential for moving forward. And he began to notice the small victories in restraint, the quiet pride in making decisions guided by respect rather than impulse, and the deepening bond with his mother that came not from avoidance but from facing difficult truths together, sharing moments of laughter, honesty, and insight that strengthened their connection in ways neither could have predicted. Margaret herself found healing in the process, realizing that parenting is less about perfection and more about presence, patience, and guidance, and that love can survive mistakes when combined with forgiveness, communication, and wisdom. And she allowed herself to feel hope again, trusting that boundaries, once respected, could create stronger foundations for both their futures, while also acknowledging that pain leaves its mark, and that remembering it serves as a compass for choices ahead. Over time, the home that had felt tense and fragile began to regain warmth, with Ethan taking initiative in household routines, conversations becoming more natural, and moments of shared humor and understanding returning. And yet, both knew that the lesson of crossing that sacred line would remain, a quiet memory etched into their shared story, shaping how they approached relationships, trust, and emotional intimacy in the future, teaching them that love is not just about closeness but about respect, restraint, and the courage to do what is right even when it is hard. By the end of these months, Ethan had grown visibly, carrying himself with a maturity that reflected both the mistakes he had faced and the wisdom he had gained, and Margaret, observing this transformation, felt a mixture of pride, relief, and lingering sorrow, understanding that some wounds heal slowly, but that healing itself can create depth and strength, a bond fortified not by perfection but by honesty, reflection, and resilience. And in that quiet, steady rhythm of life, they both recognized that what had once threatened to fracture their connection had instead become a foundation for trust, understanding, and a more conscious, thoughtful love, one that could endure challenges, temptations, and misunderstandings with patience, empathy, and the unwavering commitment to protect what truly matters, proving that even after pain, growth and healing are possible when guided by honesty, accountability, and care.